Well, the deep state mafia just scored some major victories over the past 24 hours. In the first instance, the Bill Clinton appointed federal judge in the Southern District of New York, Lewis Kaplan, ruled to keep secret the two entities that funded Sam Bankman-Fried's $250 million bail. SBF got to spend the holiday at his parents' home in California, but the judge is hiding the names of those who are paying SBF's bond. So score one for the deep state mafia. Maybe it was Bill Clinton himself or the Clinton Foundation who put up the money. We'll never know about it. And the second story involves the Attorney General of the Virgin Islands, top prosecutor who reached a more than $105 million settlement with Jeffrey Epstein's estate, lost her job just days after suing JP Morgan Chase in connection with her probe. She accused JP Morgan of facilitating and concealing Jeffrey Epstein's human trafficking network, and she was suddenly fired for it. For more on this, we want to bring in excellent journalist Whitney Webb, the author of the two-part book, One Nation Under Blackmail, the sordid union between intelligence and crime that gave rise to Jeffrey Epstein. Whitney, Happy New Year to you. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks. It's great to be back.
So let's start with the Epstein story. I mean, this is a pretty, to me, struck me as pretty odd. Just a few days after this Virginia Islands top prosecutor files this suit against JP Morgan Chase, she suddenly loses her job. Can you pull back the curtain on this story for us?
Yeah, so I've said before in past interviews that when you look at the difference between the sex trafficking cases that were targeting Epstein and his estate versus the ones that were pursuing a more financial angle, there's a very big difference in how those have played out. So before this case, what we had was the case involving Jeffrey Epstein and Deutsche Bank. And over the course of that case, I'm sure probably your audience might remember this, the home of the judge was shot up and her son was murdered on the eve of that trial beginning. And, in my opinion, they don't really want the financial angle to come out because it's a lot more damaging to them. As I've talked about about my work on the Epstein case, it's very clear to me that he was just as much a financial criminal as a sex criminal. So the financial crimes involve a whole host of institutions and powerful individuals. And I think there's a much more concerted effort there to keep that information from coming to light. And that's what you have this, the main focus when it comes to Epstein is consistently sex trafficking, not the financial crimes. So the second you have people start digging into the financial aspect of his activities, the bigger the guns are that come out, I guess you could say. So I'm not really surprised that this lady ended up losing her job. Now, the governor of the Virgin Islands has claimed that it wasn't related to this particular case, but he did say that he was displeased with this woman as Attorney General with her previous lawsuits against Epstein's estate. So it is related to the estate, even if he claims it's not related to this particular case. But I don't really know about that. Also, from what I understand, the lawsuit itself had several large redacted components that were referring to JP Morgan's facilitation of Epstein's sex trafficking activities in the island. Right. And one of the accounts that was a focus of that lawsuit is very interesting. Refers to Southern Trust. So Southern Trust was also a company that Jeffrey Epstein ran from the Virgin Islands. And so the lawsuit claims that this was basically a front for the trafficking activities and that JP Morgan was aware of this. But Southern Trust also, according to Virgin Islands records, Epstein was trying to create basically a genomic sequencing company, was trying to use it to obtain the genetic sequences of most native islanders on the Virgin Islands and try and turn it into what he referred to as a biomedical Google. This is back in 2012 or so, showed a very unusual interest in wanting to basically have a class of young islanders that he would train and all of this weird stuff around this company. And it's been very poorly explored, even by the government of the Virgin Islands itself. And so now that you have this woman being fired, it's very likely that will have an effect on her successors and their willingness to pursue any of these threads related to the Epstein case as it relates specifically to the Virgin Island activities, which again, as I just said, have not been well explored.
And so who do you think is pulling the strings on this? I mean, is it JP Morgan? Is JP Morgan itself that powerful? I mean, as a large financial institution?
Well, Yeah, so I'll give you an example about JP Morgan. JP Morgan's the head of it is Jamie Dimon, right? So
Right.
Jamie Dimon was selected by a group of people, and one of those people is a guy named, I think his first name's Alan Kessler, who is the co-founder with Leslie Wexner of the New Albany Company, in which Epstein himself was intimately involved. But he's one of Leslie Wexner's closest business associates, and he is intimately involved with JP Morgan and was involved in having the head of JP Morgan being selected for that very role in the early 2000s. And if we remember back to, JP Morgan is what ended up absorbing Bear Stearns, which had previously been Epstein's bank. And his former employer as well was absorbed into JP Morgan. And he used JP Morgan for a while, but was later dumped by that bank and then went to Deutsche Bank. So he's had a series of banks that he's used over the years, but JP Morgan is definitely one of the more suspect ones, and has some pretty clear connections to this relatively close-lit network around Epstein and Wexner.
Do you think we'll get answers out of the Virgin Islands if you have the top prosecutor being fired? Does it seem like we're going to be able to pull those threads any further, or is anyone else willing to stick their neck out in that way?
I think within the government of the Virgin Islands, remember, this is the U.S. Virgin Islands, so it's basically, essentially a colony of the United States. And while you have, the current administration in the U.S. and, most likely, successor governments, it's very unlikely, I think, that we'll see any change here. You're not going to, obviously this lady was fired because of her willingness to go after people that were inconvenient. Well, she was willing to pursue legal action that was inconvenient to the powers that be and essentially dominate the Virgin Islands, right? So there's a sovereignty issue there, I think, is part of it. But I think the firing is obviously going to make a statement, and make a point to her, Denise Gregory's successors, that they can't, if they want to keep their job, they can't go the same route she did, basically.
And you mentioned Jamie Dimon. I can't help but think when she lays out in her lawsuit, there was the concealing, the facilitation of Epstein's human trafficking network, so helping to facilitate it, and the concealing of it, the hiding of it. I mean, that seems to be pretty. She has pretty strong evidence. She's going to make that claim in a lawsuit. Do you think that this goes all the way? What do you think that means? And do you think this goes all the way to the top, to the Jamie Dimon level?
Well, it definitely goes pretty high up in both JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank. We know that in some of these banks, for example, there were suspicious activity reports about Epstein, and that they were flagged by people at the bank, and then people above them, basically stopped any sort of investigation into those suspicious activity reports.
Wow.
And there was quite a decent number of them at the time. I think there's more reporting on that from the Deutsche Bank side than the JP Morgan side, but I believe this was known to have happened at both banks a couple years ago. So yeah, I'm sure she had plenty of evidence.
God, what they're trying to hide is unbelievable. And then that brings us to the SBF story. What are they trying to hide here? So Sam Bankman-Fried gets to spend Christmas with his parents. Someone or multiple institutions or multiple groups put up about $250 million in bond to get him out on bail. They still have yet, according to the reports I'm reading, to even put that money up. They've made guarantees of putting up $250 million. So he gets to go spend Christmas with his family in California. And this judge yesterday, this Clinton appointed judge in the Southern District of New York, says, we're not going to unseal those names of who put up that money, even though there's been many requests for that. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so basically this isn't surprising. This is the latest move in a succession of moves to obfuscate other people that were involved with FTX or Sam Bankman-Fried, as it relates to the Ponzi scheme of FTX. So earlier on, for example, there were people, I think it was the Martins at Wall Street on Parade, reported that it was very odd that certain moves were made in court as relatively soon after the bankruptcy proceedings began, to obfuscate who exactly had appointed the interim CEO of FTX, and who had put Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm, which is very much tied to the U.S. intelligence apparatus, having been the law firm of the Dulles brothers, for example. that they were apparently making decisions, but someone had put them in that position to do that. And then also there was an effort to obfuscate people aside from Sam Bankman-Fried and some of his closest associate whose names are known, what other people had access to those accounts or company entities. There's been an effort to obfuscate certain people from the public eye. So, it's very possible there could be an overlap there with the people paying his bail because they don't want their involvement in this whole scandal to come out necessarily. But what they're trying to do here is trying to do what I would basically say a controlled demolition of the whole FTX scenario. It's very much like what we saw, I think, with the Ghislaine Maxwell trial. There's an effort to control the narrative more than anything else, give the appearance that justice was done, and hope that this will go away, and hope that they can just memory hole the story. So, like with Ghislaine Maxwell, there was a lot of weird stuff going on in that trial. You actually, by the way, have an overlap with the legal team of Sam Bankman-Fried. Has one of Ghislaine Maxwell's defense lawyers on his legal team.
You can't make this up.
Oddly, oddly enough. But with SBF, they want to paint the narrative that it was just one guy doing bad things, and he didn't have any sort of bigger sponsorship behind him that's being allowed to remain hidden during this whole process. And I think that's the same essentially that happened with Ghislaine Maxwell. It was all Ghislaine Maxwell. It was all Epstein. There was no one else. Let's not talk about Leslie Wexner. Let's not talk about any of these other powerful people involved, or any of the cash flows, or any of that, or Ghislaine Maxwell's family ties to intelligence, or none of that was brought up. And I think it's going to be the same thing with Sam Bankman-Fried. They want a very specific narrative to be out there, and they don't want people looking on the periphery of what they're trying to have people focus on, which is just SBF. Are they going to crucify the guy or let him off? I don't know. I think enough people are angry that they feel like they have, in order to maintain the veneer that our justice system works, have to, take him down to some extent. But look at Ghislaine Maxwell. She's in country club prison right now for basically being the madam of an industrial human trafficking operation. And she's doing like yoga and having vegan Thanksgiving dinners and stuff. It's not exactly hard time like most people think of it. And it's very possible that she could be, have parole at some point in the not so distant future. I mean, who really knows? Because no one's really paying attention, right? And I think it's the same. It could probably go the same way with SBF. It wouldn't surprise me at all. But I think there's going to be an effort, as there already has been, an effort to restrict the names of certain parties from being revealed in court.
And the
fact that this judge is doing that, I think it's going to keep happening throughout the course of the trial.
I'll get you out of here on this question, which is, I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, that he pled not guilty. And so now we're going to go to trial on this. Do you think that we'll see that this is going to happen? I mean, I'm asking you to sort of prognosticate, but there's going to be discovery. We're going to hear presumably we'll hear a lot of evidence to support his innocence here. Is he going to name names? I mean, I thought that there would reach some sort of a settlement. This would be kept quiet.
Well, two of the other top people at FTX, Carolyn Ellison being one of them, have pled guilty, actually. And so the evidence of that case, I mean, there'll probably be some overlap there. They're cooperating with prosecutors. Those prosecutors will come with that evidence, most likely, against Sam Bankman-Fried. It's very possible that Sam Bankman-Fried will try and use as his justification all sorts of things that we've already seen him do in his public interviews since the bankruptcy, saying, "Oh, I was just in over my head, and I just wanted to do all this good." Sort of, he'll refer back to his involvement with the effective altruist movement and things of that nature. I'm sure he's just going to try and wiggle his way out, essentially. But the point I want to make here is that people like Sam Bankman-Fried, and even people like Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein, they're the ones put in the public eye, and I would argue that's because they're middle management. The people that are pulling their strings, they always try and hide, and they generally succeed in doing that. But it's incumbent on us to try and follow the threads that we can find that they haven't tied up completely and pursue that to get a closer look at what's actually going on here, because it's very clear to me, at least in the case of FTX, just like the Epstein case, there's obviously a lot more going on there. And I think it's very interesting, the similarities between Sam Bankman-Fried's involvement with the most recent election, and then you look at how Epstein was involved with the Clintons' 1996 campaign finance scandal, and you have a lot of overlap with that, and what happened relatively recently with FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, and the Democratic Party in Ukraine, and all of that. It seems to me that there's a certain network here that engages in these patterns of behavior. Because remember, before Epstein did that for the Clintons, he was a Ponzi schemer, just like Sam Bankman-Fried, apparently.
Right.
And
And left with a slap on the hand, and that's about it. Slap on the wrist.
Yeah, his name gets dropped from the case, and he goes straight to major DNC fundraising stuff. So, this I would argue that there's a lot more of a pattern here, and I would encourage people to look for those patterns. There's obviously a much bigger story here.
Well, that's why we love having you on, because if there's one person that can get to the heart of this, it's you. Thank you for the great work you continue to do. We appreciate it, and thanks for joining us once again, Whitney. Have a happy New Year to you.
Thanks so much. You too.